let's go ahead and get started with our welcome. So I'd like to introduce myself first. I'm Sarah Verbeest, and I am the director of the Jordan Institute for Families at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And so excited to welcome you all into this space together. Allison, can you do the next slide for me?
Absolutely.
So just a little housekeeping. So first of all, you all can relax. You are not on video and your phone lines are muted. So this gives you a chance to just really enjoy and engage in the content without worrying about audio and visual interruptions. So please take that as a sign to relax and enjoy. That said, we do want the chat to be active. So please share your questions and ideas with the panelists and attendees as we go. We'll be keeping our eye on the chat, and we'll do our best to make sure that your voices are heard in that way. We are recording this session, and we'll be posting it to our website. So if you want to go back and listen, or you're trying to take notes, don't worry. You'll have we will make sure that that gets to you. And we do have a quick evaluation at the end. It's so important to us, and we hope that you'll take a few minutes to complete that when we're done. So who is in the room? So this slide gives you a sense as to who is joining us in this space today. We had over 1,000 people register with us, which is just super exciting. And I know that you all can read and see the screen. You'll see that we have quite a variety of agencies represented with us, with our folks from state government and higher education, nonprofits, being among the majority of you, but we have folks from military, international, for-profit, really exciting. We definitely have a variety of skills and years of experience. So we have folks that are newer in this space, so welcome, and then others who have been doing this work for more than 15 years. Always something to learn, right? And then lots of different work. We have lots of folks that we're welcoming from child welfare and implementation science and mental and behavioral health, as well as lots of other colleagues as well. Next slide. We also see that we are largely dialing in from North America today, and really appreciate those of us joining us from other countries. Welcome. And something that we've been really paying attention to is thinking about what are some of the other identities that we bring to this space. And we still see that most of us would identify as white on Hispanic. And we really hope to continue to make a space to welcome and grow participation from folks that bring lots of other identities to this work, as well as being super valuable and important to our work together. Next slide. Okay, so we are going to warm up the poll. So this is a quick one, so answer quick. So if you look around you, how many cups of coffee, tea, water, and other beverages do you have surrounding your desk and work area right now? Take a quick count and click your answer.
Entries are coming in quickly. We're at about 80%.
I'm expecting LA has probably got at least 2 cups of coffee out there. I would be surprised.
Okay, let's go ahead and end the poll there, and I will share the results.
Okay, so we've got about 0 to 1 going, moving to 2 to 3. I've lost count. We feel you. Thank you. And then we have one more poll question. So what is the first thing that you're going to do after this meeting? So your choices are get up and stretch, which we'd also like to remind you, since you're not on video, you can get up and stretch at any time. You're going to check on children, check your email, log out, because after this, there's just nothing else that could be done for the day. Or you're going to run and tell your colleagues how great this session was. Again, we're just trying to warm up our chats. If you could put your answer in real quick.
What about 75% response rate and climbing?
See, I would say many people have at least one beverage in that 0 to 1. Excellent. Get up and stretch, check on your kids, check your email. Log out, done for the day. I'm guessing those are our folks maybe from South Africa and Europe. And tell folks how great this was. Well, thank you all for indulging us with the chance to start to bring you in and create the best community that we can in this online space. Next slide, Allison. So as we go, we would really love it if you all have heard something that is just a show-stopping statement or something that really resonates with you. We'd love for you to tweet it using our new hashtag. For those of you that have been with us throughout the series, you'll notice that this is a little bit different. We really wanted to focus on the practice component of our work, and so we renamed our hashtag to @UNC Practice 2021. So please do connect in that social media space. Next slide. So what are we going to do together with our time? So these are the objectives of what we are aiming to accomplish. We're going to talk about the role of psychological safety and promoting a safety culture in implementation and evidence use. We're going to talk about implementation challenges within the context of traumatized organizations and systems. We are going to offer some case examples of building a safety culture as the foundation for implementation. And we're going to describe the role of leadership in creating psychological safety among staff and stakeholders. And so this is our agenda for the day. You are welcomed. We are going to frame and do some stage setting, and then we have amazing panelists who are going to speak to you. We'll have a chance for audience Q&A, and we're going to close with a call to action and a preview for what's ahead. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to my friend and colleague, Allison Metz.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Yes, everyone is indeed most welcome. We were absolutely thrilled for the turnout for today and the amount of folks that registered, and we're so happy for folks that were able to join us live this morning, East Coast time. I just wanted to take a little bit of a moment to talk about why it is that we really want to focus on the concept of psychological safety and the role that that plays in implementation. I think folks may know that we've used our platform for these webinars and the events we had in person prior to the pandemic to really lift up, as Sarah said, implementation practice, but we have spent a lot of time lifting up the importance of trusting relationships as foundational for implementation and change efforts, and really supporting evidence use and our ability to improve outcomes as well as advance equity. So as we thought about this topic more, we were reminded of the fact that implementation really relies on collaborative learning, taking risks, being okay with failure, because failure is actually a learning moment. And at the center of all of that is vulnerability, trust, and psychological safety. So we wanted to spend some time today really zeroing in on this concept of psychological safety, which you may we're going to have folks define that in more detail as we move through, but just generally speaking, thinking about how safe you feel in your work environment to ask a question, to show concern, to disagree, to make a mistake and feel supported through it. Many of us either work in service systems or support implementation in service systems where staff and leadership don't feel psychologically safe. The communities that are served also don't feel safe. And folks don't feel comfortable making mistakes. They're working in environments where there's not enough resources to support the work that they do. We work in service systems where many staff experience secondary trauma and demonstrate signs of being traumatized, and the systems and organizations that they work in also show signs of trauma. And so, as we think about that in the context of implementation, we really wanted to make this construct more visible. And so as we think about psychological safety and really more broadly, the concept of a safety culture, there are ways to make this visible in our implementation work, both in implementation research and implementation practice. So for example, one of the ways that something can be visible is by measuring it. And so I just put on the screen here an organizational assessment, a safety culture survey developed by the Center for Innovation and Population Health at the University of Kentucky. And you can see constructs on this slide, including emotional exhaustion, psychological safety, workplace safety, racial justice, workplace connectedness, personal safety. This is particularly focused on child welfare systems. You can see the intention to remain employed in the child welfare system. These are really important constructs to look at as part of implementation. And one of the things that we know is that when we don't pay attention to psychological safety and more broadly, a culture of safety in the places we work, implementation efforts will most certainly be challenged. So we believe, and we're taking kind of a point of view today, that assessing and building a culture of safety should be centered in our implementation practice. And there's just a handful of ways on this slide that shows how it could be helpful, but we truly believe that that list is endless. So if you look on the right side of the slide, you see many common aspects of implementation science and the things that we lift up as really important to supporting change efforts. So I'll just name a couple and think about how, if we pay attention to psychological safety and the idea of whether a culture of safety exists, could really change the way that we conduct our work in the field of implementation. So if we think about readiness assessments, they're often focused on capacity and resources. If they're focused on staff, they might be focused on things like staff knowledge or attitudes, or their readiness to change. But we're not often measuring the things I had on the previous slide, the extent to which staff are emotionally exhausted, stressed out, don't feel safe making a mistake. These are things that are really important for us to know at baseline as we move into implementation efforts, and can be a really good part of our implementation planning efforts. If you think about leadership, something we often do when we're providing implementation support is cultivating leaders, is building leadership capacity to both support and sustain implementation in the agencies that folks are leading. But we also know that leaders need to model and promote a safety culture in their agencies so that staff can feel comfortable innovating, that they can feel comfortable being part of a continuous learning, that they don't view a fidelity checklist as something to be afraid of, that it's part of the process of learning, which really speaks to how we use data for improvement and the extent to which we're working in compliance-driven systems where additional compliance metrics like a fidelity assessment could in fact continue to make someone feel less safe in the environment. So I'm not saying that fidelity assessments are not important, but if we don't look at this through the lens of safety culture, we're really missing an important opportunity in the field of implementation science to bring this work into our own practice. So we're just so excited to talk about it today. And we think that we're going to dedicate some other sessions to this as we think about what it means for both implementation research and implementation practice to really bring these constructs into our everyday work in the field of implementation. So that said, we have an amazing group of speakers for you today. I am 100% convinced that when this is over, you'll click on the last part of that poll, which is you're going to run and tell folks how amazing this session was. So I'm going to walk through these panelists in a little bit of a different order than you see on the slides, because I'm going to describe really the arc of learning and discussion that we want to put forth for you guys today. So I'll kind of walk through who's going to begin and close this out in this work. And as I introduce folks, I also just want to say on a personal basis that each one of these women has influenced me, changed my thinking, contributed to my implementation practice. And we wouldn't even have this session, this idea of thinking about the role of psychological safety and implementation science if it wasn't for these women. And so I think they really bring the human aspect into implementation and hopefully remind us of that as we move through this and we work in really complex systems and communities. So Robin Leake, who's with the University of Denver School of Social Work, she's the executive director of the Butler Institute for Families, is also the project director for the National Child Welfare Workforce Institute. She's going to kick us off by doing some stage setting. We're going to use the child welfare, public child welfare system as an example today about what it means to lift up safety culture in implementation work. And so Robin's going to do some really nice stage setting as to why that's important. Cynthia Franco, who is the director of the Child Fatality Review Team at New York City's Administration for Children's Services, will help us define what a safety culture is and actually lead us through some reflective practice today. So I hope you're game to reflect and and think about your experiences and the jobs that you've had. Cynthia will also then work with her colleague, Deborah Rubian, who is the Director of Special Projects for the Workforce Institute at New York City's Administration for Children's Services, to talk about specifically a case example of how New York City's child welfare system is seeking to implement a system-wide culture of safety. And that's going to be a really great case example. Dr. Kimberly Mann, who is the Deputy Director of Child Wellbeing and Research for Illinois' Department of Children and Family Services, is going to talk about the work of reflective practice and how critical that is for promoting safety and for supporting implementation. It is something that I think a lot of us as practitioners know is so critical, but really drawing those connections to why reflective practice is so important for change to be successful. I think Dr. Mann is going to do a great job talking that through. And then Lacey DeSherry is going to close us out. Lacey is a consultant and an author, an international speaker. She is, if folks are fans of Brene Brown, Lacey is trained by Brene Brown. She is a Dare to Lead facilitator, and she is going to talk to us about the role of leadership and how leaders can promote a safety culture. And as we think about multi-level change and how important it is to pull those different levers in a system to support systems change, I think ending with us thinking about the role of leaders and how we as implementation practitioners can support leaders in supporting others to have a culture of safety, and what that could mean for successful and sustainable implementation efforts that then improve and advance equitable outcomes for the populations we work with. So this is going to be an incredible panel. Our moderators today are myself. Oh my gosh, I probably didn't even introduce myself, Sarah, after all that. So Allison, I'm Allison Metz. I think I recognize so many people or participants. I direct the National Implementation Research Network at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at UNC Chapel Hill, and also on faculty at our School of Social Work, and just an incredible partnership with Sarah on running these events. So I'm so happy to have you here. Sarah has introduced herself, and Christine Andrews, who is a program director with Child Trends and a consultant, is going to be our facilitator extraordinaire today. She has been leading us through the chat for these events for quite some time, and it's a tough job. So we're so happy to have Christine here with us again. And with that very long stage setting and introduction, I am going to hand it off to Robin Leake, who is going to kick off our panel today. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Allison. I'm delighted to be here with everyone today to help kick off this incredible panel of experts and discuss this really wonderful topic. As Allison mentioned, my name is Robin Leake. I'm a research professor at the University of Denver Graduate School of Social Work and the director of the National Child Welfare Workforce Institute. I have worked with a variety of human service agencies, school districts, and nonprofits throughout my career, but most of my work has focused on organizational and workforce development in public, private, and tribal child welfare programs. And because child welfare, as we all know, and Allison just talked about, is one of the most challenging work environments, it provides fertile ground for exploration and study. And while we're all gathered here remotely and virtually, we're all physically in a place and all across the globe, and that was really wonderful to see. My work is based in Denver, but I live in Bedford, Massachusetts, which is located on the ancestral colonized Massachusetts and Nipmuc tribal territories. Next slide, please. So what is organizational culture? It's a phrase we hear a lot, usually in the same sentence as organizational climate and culture. And for the purposes of this discussion, we can think of organizational culture as a shared set of expectations about how work gets done here. It's the personality of an organization. And while everyone plays a role in shaping culture, it's really widely thought to be created and reinforced by agency leadership. And you'll hear a lot about the critical role that leaders play in creating cultures of safety. Organizational culture is about the story in which people in an organization are embedded and the values and rituals that reinforce that narrative. Organizational cultures, fortunately, are not fixed, and in fact, they can be quite dynamic and ever-shifting. Next slide, please. So organizations that are considered psychologically safe have several defining characteristics, including staff feeling valued and appreciated for their contributions to the agency and the work that they do, staff having the tools and resources that they need to work effectively. And so this can be tangible resources like computers, software, cell phones, as well as intangible resources like access to training and career ladders and manageable caseloads. Working in a learning organization where staff are encouraged to try new things and ask what went wrong and learn from mistakes. And in a learning organization, individuals are not blamed and shamed when mistakes are made, but instead leaders really seek to discover what are some of the systemic issues that led to mistakes in the first place. Agencies where the physical, emotional well-being of staff is nurtured and protected, and an agency that prioritizes racial equity and inclusivity. Also, where staff feel support from leadership and supervisors and peers, and where the job is understood and valued by the community. This is often an overlooked aspect of safety cultures, and I was reminded when I was preparing these slides of a recent conversation I had with a child welfare manager, and she was describing how staff were still mistrusted by the community and still thought of as baby snatchers. And she really spoke poignantly about the pain and sorrow that this caused for her staff, who were they themselves members of the community. Next slide, please. So the National Child Welfare Workforce Institute works to build partnerships between public and tribal child welfare agencies and university schools of social work to really build the capacity of the workforce. And in this work, we have conducted organizational health assessments with 7 child welfare programs that include 2 states and 2 counties and 3 tribal programs. We've analyzed data collected in 2019 from over 4,000 child welfare staff to look at issues specifically related to organizational safety culture. So a little bit about this sample and the organizations. Turnover across the 7 sites ranged from 20 to 40%, which is a typical level of turnover for child welfare staff. And when you consider the cost and impact of 1/3 of your workforce turning over every year, you can really understand how disruptive this is to organizational culture and service delivery to children and families. Remarkably, all of the staff in our sample of thousands of child welfare workers reported high levels of job stress and some level of work-related burnout. Burnout is a concept you've probably heard a lot about, especially since it was given an official designation by the World Health Organization. A common definition of burnout is feelings of overwhelm and emotional exhaustion. And we often distinguish between burnout that originates from a stressful work environment and burnout that comes from working with traumatized children and families. And in our sample, 49% of caseworkers and 63% of supervisors reported high levels of work-related burnout. 50% of our sample reported that their workload is too high. And in addition, 46% reported levels of secondary traumatic stress symptoms that meet the definitional threshold for post-traumatic stress disorder. Next slide, please. The National Child Welfare Workforce Institute Organizational Health Assessment also includes a measure of psychological safety by Amy Edmondson, and mean scores of child welfare workers across our sample indicate that the majority of staff feel unsafe to take risks in their agency. They feel undermined in their decision-making and also afraid to voice disagreement with supervisors and managers. We also look at the moral distress that occurs when a professional knows the ethically appropriate action, but is unable to take that action because of external or internal constraints. What we found in the data is that over 60% of child welfare staff experience some level of moral distress in this job. A common occurrence of moral distress is perhaps when a worker feels insufficiently trained or doesn't have the time to provide services that they know families really need, whether these be around trauma, mental or behavioral health services, or even just the ability to provide supports around basic needs, around food or housing. We do also know from the data that child welfare staff are less likely to experience moral distress when they work in agencies with high safety climates. Black, Indigenous, and staff of color also report more organizational bias, prejudice, and discrimination in the workplace compared with white staff. And in our work with child welfare programs to address racial equity, we hear from staff of color about their feelings of lack of safety in the office. One supervisor talked about how she encourages all of her workers to develop self-care plans and take vacation time. And yet, as a Black woman, she feels that if she takes time off or regularly breaks for lunch, she will be judged harshly. As she put it, we are held to a higher standard than our white colleagues. Finally, I also want to mention the high levels of threats to physical safety, because it's challenging to feel emotionally or psychologically safe in the workplace when your physical safety is at risk. In fact, 73% of staff in our sample report that they've been yelled at or sworn at by a client, and 37% have been physically threatened on the job. It's critical for child welfare leaders and administrators to recognize and acknowledge and mitigate the physical risks to their workforce. And sometimes we see leaders, unfortunately, minimize or rationalize safety threats. It's just the nature of the work. We all have been through this, where we see leaders who are really committed to creating a culture of safety convey in words and actions that they really care about the physical safety of their workforce. This can be creating policies where workers don't go out on investigations alone, making sure the parking lots are lit, and really having supports in place for when incidents do happen with their workers. Next slide, please. So I talked at the beginning about hallmarks of a safety culture, and we measure many of these factors. And in fact, while there's high levels of trauma and lack of safety in child welfare agencies, there's also quite a bit of resilience as well. And some of these factors that are resiliency factors in an organization are high levels of supervisor and peer support, feelings of job importance, and the conviction of staff that the work that they're doing is really making a difference for children and families. Child welfare workers feel a deep sense of commitment and care for the children and families that they serve. And finally, workers who are able to access services for families and collaborate with service providers report higher levels of job satisfaction and safety. So you're going to hear from our next wonderful slate of panelists who are going to discuss innovative and effective ways to implement safety cultures in child welfare agencies based on lived experiences. So I'm going to now turn this over to Cynthia Franco. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. So I'm Cynthia Franco, and when I am not at my full-time job as a mother and a wife, I'm working at ACS alongside the greatest professionals I've ever encountered, the New York City Child Fatality Review Team. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them later, but for now, I'm absolutely thrilled to talk about a topic that I'm very passionate about, which is psychological safety and safe workplace cultures. So I will jump right in. Next slide. A key component in creating psychological safety is never assuming everyone is at the same place. So I'd like to review a few terms. So as you've heard, if you heard from Dr. Lee, organizational culture is basically the way things are done. It's important to note that culture consists of people, their behavior, practices, and the systems that they evolve in. Next slide. Usually when we think of a safe workplace, we usually think of things like a trip, or whether they're trip and fall hazards or sufficient fire exits. Today and moving forward, I urge you to really move away from that and focus on the overall well-being of people within an organization. which includes emotional and mental well-being in addition to physical safety. So in summary, organizational culture embodies the way things are done, and a safe workplace considers the emotional and mental well-being of staff in addition to physical safety. Next slide. Now I'd like you all to get comfortable. I'd like to invite you all to take a journey with me, a journey through two very distinct workplace environments. As we take this journey, please share in the chat any feelings that come up for you, any feelings that you believe an employee would have in this particular workplace, or perhaps feelings that you had or have if you've experienced this type of workplace. So let's begin. Imagine yourself at the most important position you've ever held. You know, that one that you were really passionate about. You are at work, your day is filled with meetings. You notice meetings seem to lack meaning or purpose. Looking around the room, you notice staff seem bored, disinterested, maybe even angry. You observe that only one or two people speak at these meetings, mainly the managers. No one seems to ask questions. When you dare to ask a question, you may be met with stares, maybe eye rolls, sometimes even a sigh or two. You begin to notice there's no peer recognition for great ideas or achievements. You have skills and talents, but no one seems interested. Rather, often you are labeled as a know-it-all, or you're told that you're pretending to be an expert. You have ideas that could improve systems and procedures in place. When you share those ideas, you're met with, leave well enough alone, or don't waste your time, nothing changes here. Even worse, when your idea is heard, your boss or colleague may take credit for it. You only see executive leaders in passing. They have no time for frontline staff. There's no time set aside for joy in the workplace, no team building activities. Leaders say they care, but their behaviors suggest otherwise. While in writing, this particular organization says they value learning and development, but there are little to no personal or professional developmental or training opportunities. Nor do they make it easy to attend these training opportunities because due dates and work expectations are not adjusted to allow time for development. Policies and new procedures are put in place without soliciting input from the very people that do the work. At times, you are uncertain about your tasks and you have questions, but you are reluctant to ask, fearful of being shamed. You push on and hope you make the right decisions. One day you make a mistake. You fear for your job, so you cover it up. And you hope and pray no one will ever know. So how did you feel in this work environment? Share some of your thoughts in the chat. What happens to relationships in this type of organization? Next slide. Christine, what's going on in the chat? Anything?
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of chat discussion here. Thank you for chiming in. Everything from just feeling defeated, feeling sad. Did I make a wrong decision taking this job? Angry, hopeless, stressed out, frustrated.
Right. So thank you, Christine, and for everybody that's chiming in. So feelings that thrive in this type of work environment, right, are anger, sadness, you're uncertain, shame, invisible, right? You see my invisible man there. You fear, right? Okay.
Disappointed, unappreciated, overwhelmed, devalued, just not really being able to bring your full self, demoralized.
Right. Thank you.
Goes on and on.
So I would venture to say that you felt unsafe in this work environment. So we're going to go ahead and call this organization Unsafe Incorporated. So Unsafe Incorporated has a broken organizational culture that clearly lacks psychological safety. So now let's take a walk through another workplace and let us know how you feel here. In this workplace, leaders take the time to get to know their staff. What they say aligns with what they do. Meetings are highly interactive. Managers talk less and listen more. Not only is innovation and curiosity welcome, but it's a requirement. Input is consistently sought from staff prior to implementing any change, policy, or procedure. Actually, because idea sharing is such a priority in this workplace, most, if not all, procedures that are put in place come from the very people that do the work. Achievements are not only acknowledged by all, but they're celebrated. Staff is empowered to make decisions and enlisted to collaboratively learn from errors to improve the system they work in. This organization provides opportunities for personal and professional development while ensuring your work doesn't pile up while you step away from your daily tasks to develop yourself and your skills. In this workplace, time is allotted for team building and fun. So what about now? How did it feel in this workplace? Next slide. Christine, anything?
Yep, valued as a person, feeling respected and appreciated, inspired, hopeful, energized, valued, motivated. I want to work there. Appreciated and energized, feeling seen, committed, supportive, excited, and a fancy word. I don't even have to say your fancy word, ebullient, I think is the word that you put in here. Visible,
Wow.
growth, empowered. It goes on and on, very positive.
Wow, beautiful. So you clearly, in this type of workplace, you would feel happy, valued. Maybe you have a sense of belonging, curious to learn and do more, excited, important, and heard. There's a sense of trust there. So we can go ahead and call this workplace Safe Incorporated. So Safe Incorporated understands that the success of its mission depends on effective employee engagement, on making it a priority to ensure staff feel safe and effectively managing all the dimensions of their journey in the workplace. Next slide. I think it's safe to say that Safe Incorporated has created a safety culture. So a safety culture is one in which organizational values, attributes, and behaviors support a safe, engaged workforce that strives to balance individual accountability with system accountability. A safety culture values open communication, feedback, and continuous learning and improvement. Next slide. So Safe Incorporated is hitting all of the elements that we need to create a safety culture, right? So they have committed leadership that gets to know their staff. There's reporting systems, idea sharing avenues, training, development, ongoing support, an environment of continuous learning and improvement. They care about and invest in staff, and they have high psychological safety. In order to create, foster, and sustain a safety culture, psychological safety must exist. Next slide. So psychological safety is the belief that you can speak up, that you show up as yourself, that you can put forward ideas, take risks, report errors without feeling that you will be ashamed. My favorite way of defining psychological safety is being able to stick your neck out without it being cut off. So the moral of my story is be daring enough to create safety. Be courageous enough to acknowledge that you cannot achieve anything without your staff. You need their commitment in order to successfully implement anything. I promise you that attempts to implement anything at Unsafe Incorporated, they're gonna fail. They'll cost a lot of money and time, and in the end, maybe you'll compel some people to do things the new way, but it won't stick because you need psychological safety to create buy-in and long-term sustainability. At Safe Incorporated, you can implement anything. As long as it aligns with the values and mission of your organization, you'll be fine because your staff trusts you. They will feel safe to bring up concerns and know their expertise will be part of the process. Psychological safety must come first for any hope of improved engagement, performance, and successful implementation efforts. My colleague, Deborah Rubian, will now join us so we can share how we are leading our organization's efforts towards creating a safety culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. That was terrific. And also thank you to Allison for inviting ACS to share what we are doing at our agency. Next slide, please. I want to start with a slide to give you some context about the size of ACS. We are New York City's government agency that oversees child welfare, juvenile justice, and subsidized early care and education services. For child welfare, ACS is responsible for protective services, foster care, adoption, and prevention services. We're large. We have a workforce of over 8,000 employees. In addition, we have another 4,000 employees that are contract provider agencies that provide the prevention services and the foster care services. In a typical year, our protective services conduct 55 to 60,000 investigations in a typical calendar year. You'll see on the slide, it was less, of course, for last year during the pandemic, but again, to give you the picture. So ACS started using a safety science approach in our child fatality reviews a few years ago, and I will pass it back to Cynthia to talk about that journey.
Thank you, Deborah. So sometimes we need to be reminded how great our organization is, right? ACS is just overwhelmingly successful in what we do. So if I asked you all what the worst thing is that can happen in a child welfare organization, I'm pretty sure we would all agree that it would be the loss of a child. I've been in the field of child welfare for a little while, and as the director of the Child Fatality Review Team, I can tell you a fatality is the single most traumatic event that can occur for our staff. Despite knowing this, somehow it seemed okay to repeatedly interrogate staff when there was a child fatality, question their decision-making, question their skill set and intentions, and somehow blame the very frontline staff that are out there risking their lives to keep children safe. That was just how it had always been done. And in 2017, our commissioner decided there had to be a better way. So ACS began efforts to create a safety culture through the child fatality review process. We began by revamping our entire review process. We started using a human factors and safety systems lens to identify opportunities for learning rather than for searching for what was not done. We now include frontline staff in our review process. We invite them to tell us the challenges they face. We collaborate with them to learn about the system they work in and encourage them to contribute to the creation of solutions. How has my team contributed to creating a safe culture at ACS through our reviews? First, we shifted from blame to curiosity. We're no longer focused on what was not done or what should have been done, but how and why decisions were made and what we can learn. We talk less, listen more. We've worked really hard at developing relationships and fostering trust with frontline staff. Everyone on my team was a frontline child protective specialist prior to joining the fatality review team. We maintain relationships with our frontline heroes. We were them. One of the things I'm proudest of is that everyone on my team strives to never forget that feeling when you knocked on a door at night in any given corner of New York City, all by yourself, not knowing what was on the other side of that door. Holding on to that feeling helps us form genuine relationships with frontline staff. We don't blame them. We do not believe that anything that they did or didn't do contributed to that fatality. What we do know is that our frontline staff has valuable data that we want to tap into to improve our system, not only for our staff, but for the children that we serve. We've also created safe avenues to share information and ideas. Our review process includes safe spaces for staff to share individually with our reviewers, or as a group identifying systemic vulnerabilities and sharing ideas. We have learned so much and continue to create ways to learn more. I always like to share the reality of this type of shift in thinking. While I'm sure you're all thinking right now, well, this all makes sense. Who would not want this type of culture? I will honestly share that when my team and I were introduced to this approach, we were hesitant. We questioned every aspect of it. We did not embrace this very easily, right? We were curious consumers. After all, we had been programmed to audit cases in search of staff failure. Our apprehension also had a lot to do with the way this new process was introduced to us. Unfortunately, as it often occurs, We were not included in the implementation and planning of this redesign. But the consummate professionals that we are, we reprogrammed our way of thinking and focused on the humanity of this approach. And now we can't imagine doing it any other way. The next challenge became moving the rest of ACS along with us. The Workforce Institute joined us in this work, and Deborah's going to share more about where we are headed.
Thanks, Cynthia. Well, the first thing we did was we conducted a listening tour. The commissioner of the Workforce Institute and I met with 11 different units within the agency to listen to their needs. We talked to quality improvement, we talked to quality assurance, we talked to external affairs, we talked to prevention, et cetera, et cetera. Many of their staff had attended orientations in safety science, and we needed to know what they wanted to do next. What did their staff need? Then we turned to Allison Metz, who has worked with ACS and many other large initiatives. We developed an implementation roadmap. We built a linked teaming structure. We started with a small core group. We formed an implementation team. We formed a governance team. We thought long and hard about who should be on the teams. You know, the details matter. We looked at all the functions within our large agency where safety culture, where that non-punitive, non-blaming approach would be most important. And so we ended up with representatives ranging from child protection to human resources to external affairs and everything in between. Next slide, please. So one of the major tasks of the implementation team is to define what a safety culture means to ACS. How will we know when there is a safety culture? What will it look like? We did a literature review, and we quickly understood that safety culture is not like those evidence-based manualized programs that we put into place that have standardized components. And we have implemented many of those at ACS. In fact, safety culture is still relatively new to child welfare. As it turns out, child welfare has more complexity and is more unpredictable than even the aviation industry and the health industry, where safety science is regularly integrated into practice. So in addition to what the literature could offer, we of course solicited input from our own implementation team and our governance team. We learned from the experience of our own child fatality review team. We put it all together and we identified the elements of a safety culture framework that fits ACS. Next slide. These are the 8 elements that we came up with. I want to note that we are in process. It may look a little different in a month, we'll see. And for each of these components, we have identified and prioritized activities. So I'll give you just 2 examples. With the third one, team building, we're prioritizing that teams develop plans to meet regularly and to establish a process for regular check-ins. You might think it was obvious, but there are teams that aren't always meeting. Relationship development, and you heard Allison speak a lot about the importance of relationship development. So we will be prioritizing relationship building activities, reflective process, coaching, empathic listening, and many more. Next slide, please. What else are we doing? You heard Allison refer to the Safety Culture Organizational Assessment, and that we are turning to the National Partnership for Child Safety, which is a national clearinghouse and technical assistance provider, bringing together many jurisdictions who are pioneering this work in child welfare. And we will be administering a Safety Culture Organizational Assessment to all 8,000 of our employees. Those results will then be used to target specific practices that we will test in our local child protection offices. We are also building other supports and infrastructure. We have developed 2 e-learn modules on safety culture that will be launched soon. We will be developing training. We will be aligning our very extensive coaching to align with safety culture as well. We'll also continue to work on aligning all policies and practices with safety science principles. And finally, we're planning an agency-wide campaign. That will involve communication from our commissioner. We'll launch our ACS framework with corresponding job aids. We'll launch the e-learns and also launch regular communication avenue that will be dedicated just to safety culture. Next slide, please. As you've heard other presenters, safety culture completely aligns with equity, inclusion, and anti-racist practices. Our agency has already been incorporating many anti-racist practices. And one that started in the Workforce Institute is now being expanded to many parts of the agency, and that is called RDI, Reflective Process. It's based on a race, diversity, intersectionality framework. I know Dr. Kimberly Mann will be speaking about reflective process in her presentation. We're coordinating with our Office of Equity Strategies and our Racial Equity Committee. We also we intentionally build psychological safety in our own implementation meetings. Cynthia and I and Allison, we help plan the meetings, and we're very intentional that our own meetings have to reflect what we are talking about. We make room for everyone to speak. We are learning communities. We watch videos together. We read together. We work to bring everybody on the same page. I want to tell you more about one of our practices. We use an equity checklist at the beginning of every meeting. This is a checklist that was developed by a group at the Workforce Institute. This group had been charged with developing a prototype related to equity that could be tested. The checklist is a series of 5 questions, and participants are asked to self-reflect. The checklist can be used in a variety of ways. We choose to say it out loud in the beginning of every meeting. We start with that checklist before we do introductions, before we do anything else. So, are you ready to try it? I see Allison is ready to try it. Hold on one moment, Allison. Okay. So if you would sit back, the first question, please. Am I focused and ready to give 100% of my attention? And before we move on, I just want to say what we ask people to say is answer that for yourself. Yes, no, partially. There's no right answer. There's no wrong answer. The goal is to bring yourself fully into the room. Next question. Am I prepared to listen to different perspectives? Next question. Am I aware of the implicit and explicit biases I may bring to the meeting? Next question. Am I aware of how my power and privilege, and that could be race, gender, age, position within the agency, may impact the conversation at the meeting? Next question. Am I prepared to be open to different people's expertise and knowledge? Thank you. Next slide. That can be powerful, right? I want to end by reviewing a list of our safety culture practices. I talked about us being a learning group. We also have continuity between groups. Everybody who is on our core group also sits on the implementation and the governance group. This establishes an important feedback loop. We also acknowledge and integrate other initiatives. We are not coming to the table and saying, drop everything. We have the best new program. Stop what you were doing. Do what I'm doing. We take a look at who's in the room. We take a look at what we've been doing at our agency. ACS has had tremendous initiatives, and we are acknowledging of all the initiatives. So for example, like early on, we sat down with our motivational interviewing folks and our coaching folks, and we came up with our shared value statements. We use implementation science. We understand we can be in various stages of implementation at the same time. We've got the child fatality review almost 1 or 2 years ahead. That's okay. We can be in those multiple stages. Sometimes it's actually going backwards or feels like it's backwards. We acknowledge that. And maybe there's some sort of apology like, oh, Maybe we needed to have done something differently 2 years ago. That's okay. We're going to do that now. And that reflects a safety culture, right? To be vulnerable, to apologize. And lastly, I'll reiterate the importance of the equity lens throughout everything. Given the nature of how racism, sexism, all the isms, how oppression works, it's hard to keep it front and center. And so we have a commitment to keeping that front and center. Next slide. Here's our contact information, and I thank you all very much for your attention. And now I pass the stage over to Dr. Kimberly Mann.
Wow, this has just been so wonderful to listen to. I want to thank Allison for this opportunity to join this wonderful panel this morning. And I want to thank each and every one of the participants for choosing us this morning. And I'm going to maybe switch gears just a little bit. This next leg of our journey together will offer some thoughts about reflective practice in child welfare, but I intend to be reflective as I walk through this with you. If anything I say resonates with you, please feel free to say, it's like a call and response in the chat. You can just say, all right, amen. And I also want to say, since I've learned now that I have music lovers out there in our international world that's sharing with us this morning, if you happen to hear a song lyric, it's only because you've given me license to do that. So next slide, please. So I want to explain why I'm calling this piece here Accidental Leadership and Moving to the Swampy Lowland. This particular quote from Donald Schoen is actually something I used at the opening of my dissertation. And it says an awful lot about how I've always thought about implementation. It, for me, captures the challenges of theories and practices such as safety science, such as implementation science, and how this all looks when we get into the spaces that my colleagues have been talking about, where there's lots of threat, where there's the challenges of complex cases. And so really, for me, this captures, this is how I ended up here. I've spent about half my career in academia and another half in practice, and the last 10 working with our state's Department of Children and Family Services. Not exactly a place I necessarily thought I'd end up, but an opportunity to think about our state's efforts to bring more trauma-informed practices to our families was the hook that got me involved, and it's the complexity that allows me to stay. We've had the pleasure of working with Allison and her team on our implementation efforts in places called immersion sites, where we struggle together in these efforts to bring practice into really complex environments. And so I ask you to think about these messy places as we go forward. Next slide, please. Schoen tells us that this work is as much art and science. And I go back to the first presentation where one of my colleagues talked about the issues of attrition that we're seeing in our profession. And this worries me greatly as someone who has both a background in preparing professionals and now supporting professionals, because one of the things that we know is that it took some time, it took some marinating to get to where we are. When I was younger, so much younger than today, back down at the University of Illinois in Champaign, that was a song lyric for anyone who didn't catch that one. I was probably one of those kind of maybe theory geeks, I've decided. And I was a person who actually believed that all this good stuff that I was studying was going to actually help me out, to do everything I would need to do when I went out to meet families. And I remember meeting that first mom who was a little high and a little naked, I might add, and thinking about what in the world am I going to draw from right now to help me in this moment as I stand here in the hot sun. And it is in that challenge between bringing knowledge, much of which has been extremely helpful to me over the years, bringing it into that art of what am I going to say to Mrs. Smith now to make her not kill me, because it was feeling pretty scary. It is that blend that we need a way to learn to figure out what's going to actually be relevant and how am I going to use it and authentically continue to be who I am. We also know that our field has been much more driven by data. And I know my interest around CQI has grown over this last 10-year period working in our system. But taking that, out, taking it to the streets to help make people think about how they are then critical in making those shifts, having them have sufficient buy-in to want to do the work and believe that they have the capacity and the ability to do the work that's going to change metrics. Finally, my interest in evidence-based interventions, our work in Family First, really speaks to a new opportunity, but also yet another one of those messy challenges. Because one of the things that I also often say about an ABI is that it's a slice of a pie. It's a slice of a piece of what a family might need. And we know that the families that we serve have complex needs and complex issues that they're challenged by. And very few of them walk up to our doorstep and knock and say, gee, I'd love some trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy because of my trauma issues. That's typically not how we meet them when we meet them on the street. We get there, but it's a slice of the pie. And so we're going to need this art and this blend of our science to get to meeting the needs of families in more comprehensive ways. Thank you. You knew I was going to the next one. So when we think about these, even the things that we're putting forward today, as we think about a safety culture, as we think about being reflective, there is this cliff that we're in danger of hitting. And that looks like a pretty scary place if you were to come to the edge of that and wonder what you were supposed to do. But notice there might be some opportunities, and notice there's also some clear indication from our light bulb that we'd have to be relational to find those opportunities. When we find that when we try to enact these practices in actual child welfare practice, and really in most fields, there can become very easily a disconnect. I remember a student telling me one day, Dr. Mann, they're trying to help make us unlearn all the stuff you're teaching us in class. We often hear working in training that professionals come back and people tell them, we don't do that here. So those are the kinds of challenge that can kill the learning environment that promotes our safety when there is a disconnect. And it is about connecting the dots where we find the opportunities. And I actually think that this is where we go from trying to be the ideal practitioner, to borrowing from Donald Winnicott, to becoming good enough. Understanding that there are these constraints on the work that we do. And in our next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of those look like. I started teaching a course in child trauma in 1997, and I've done it now for over 2 decades. And one of the things that I am very certain about from those experiences is that there is no us and them, it's just us. When we talked about secondary trauma and toxic stress that we deal with in the workplace, we have to also bring into that equation the fact that most of the professionals that are serving our families have themselves had adverse childhood experiences. Some of us have calculated our own ACE scores and know it's not an us and a them, it's just an us. So by virtue of our lived experiences, we have this extra layer of pressure on us that can really challenge us in enacting the practices that we're hoping to do. I got an amen. I thought I saw that. Thank you. We know that when we also come to the system and maybe encounter that not so safe environment that we heard from in our earlier 2 organizations, we know that we can bring then even greater toxic stress, because now we're dealing with an environment that doesn't support who we are and what we've been through. And then we meet families who are bringing to us situations that are just beyond imaginable at times. There are times when I've just read a record that has stayed with me for days, that something in a paragraph has just hung there, Because one of the things that we're thinking about in a more trauma-informed practice is leaning into the experience of someone who has experienced the unimaginable. And we're being asked to bear witness to that. And that is an incredibly challenging thing to ask people to do day after day after day. I always mess this guy's name up, but I'm reading a book by, I believe, Jamil Zakai, who talks about this challenge that we have for empathy and understanding that it is hard for us to constantly lean in and look at things that are really hard, respond, and deal with bureaucracies and policies and paperwork and all the other challenges that we're going to have to deal with on a daily basis. But it is possible. And some of the ways that we've been doing that, surprise, surprise, the solutions, you can go to the next slide, Allison, thanks, are going to be relational. I've been thinking as I've been listening to my colleagues talking about Vygotsky, who talks about a zone of proximal development. And if we're ever going to have a learning culture, there's got to be a relationship. Like many of my colleagues, especially my New York colleagues, we too have developed teams and our team structures in something called immersion sites. And we use the naturally formed teams that exist with supervisors and their staff to, one, support our continued learning. We already had a really well-defined core practice model that looked at a lot of the great practices that we teach in social work, as well as trauma-informed care and family-centered practice and strengths-based practice. We even had, and we've had for years in our system, a lot of coaching elements. But what we think about in working in our teams is that people need constant tools and resources to reinforce the work that they're trying to do. Because it's often the problem of application that's where the art lives in a reflective practice, and knowing, how do I use all the 25 things you just told me about with this family, and still doing it in an authentic way where I am using myself as well. Because that's what the family is going to respond to. They're not going to respond to our evidence-based manual that says we're at session 1 and we're going to do, you know, this, I'm going to do engagement with you now. That's not what they're going to respond to. I always remind professionals that families are assessing you just as you are assessing them. And they're trying to figure out if you're going to be someone who can be helpful to them. And so we, by supporting people in a relational way, we allow them to then engage in better relationships with the families they serve. So teams have been critical. In those teams, we are bringing data about how we're performing on various elements of our core practice model, from have we gotten the training to are we actually doing the practice? And one of the big areas that we pay attention to is our core practice of what we call coordination of care, and how that manifests itself in a child and family team meeting. But even there's a lot, and there's a lot of complexity. And so we find that it's really critical that we name things as we're going along, so that we can all think about the same work at the same time. And that's what teams are really good at doing. And we are really grateful for NERND leading us around thinking around, using those structures. Shared focus, shared understanding, common language is going to be critical for moving the work forward, but also for making people feel like we're all doing the same thing. That then creates a space that allows us to deal with the hard work. One of the things that I've often thought about as I've been, encountering various challenges amongst professionals. I remember going out, I think we need to back up one slide. Going out and that's okay, Allison, and having a really difficult meeting with judges. And I remember coming back to my team, and as we debriefed, I realized I really wasn't stressed about the meeting because I had that soft place to land. That was my last song lyric, and not sure if anybody caught that one. But it is critical that we have that soft place to come back to, that home base, that nurturing base, that secure base. That supports us and allows us to go back out and do not only the hard work, but to continue to stay present and to stay available for the work of dealing with such difficult situations as we deal with. Within our model of the court practice model, we've developed something called a model of supervisory practice. And that has 4 elements. And I think that's where I'll be ending. But I think it's really important to think about really guiding these relationships, and particularly supervisory relationships, in this way. The first element is just supportive, and that's support for the worker. That's about, making sure that we're asking questions like, how was that for you? Are you okay? And just remembering how hard it is for our staff to encounter the things that they must encounter on a daily basis. The next element is developmental, and that's about our shared, our ongoing commitment to professional learning and growing as professionals. And so developmental is about thinking about things that might continue to build a person's skill base. And those can be very unique from one individual to another. People may talk about things that they find to be particularly hard in supervision, and you want to give people an opportunity to pursue those things in professional development. And again, I really appreciated it from New York. It doesn't have to be going to a seminar or webinar. It could also be getting an article and talking about it together in supervision. Watching a movie, I've used those a lot in class, and debriefing a little bit how that was relevant. Clinical is the piece that looks at the family's complexity. In one of my programs, which is a baby court program in Illinois, we've been capturing data on the complexity of our families. And we talk about the big 3: mental health, substance abuse, and domestic violence. And we actually track by family, at what rate those show up. And I don't think it will surprise most of the folks on this webinar that we have what we often call the trifecta, all 3 being present in many, many families. And so that clinical guidance is critical when you're trying to navigate around all of those issues, as well as then support parenting, which is the crux of what we deal with in child welfare. And I did not, it's no accident that I put administrative last. That's about our policies and our practice. But I think that will come in line if we're doing all these other pieces to support our staff. And so obviously this is where the paperwork has to get done and the boxes get checked and rules and procedures get followed. But I think all of that gets done in the context of a relationship. So I've asked you to think about how these things, in terms of we as individuals, as human beings, and as leaders, have to be more reflective. And I'm going to be turning it over to my colleague, Lacey DeSherry, who's going to talk more about leadership as we dare to lead.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here, and a big thank you to Allison and all of my other colleagues on the call who I'm just in awe listening to the amazing work that you guys have been doing. So, 2 of my favorite subjects, leadership and psychological safety. And so I'm really grateful to get to be here today. Next slide. So I want to start with a quote from the amazing Brene Brown, and I'm going to pull from some of her work because really the work that she does, the 4 skill sets of courage and the daring leadership skills, are the skills that we need in order to build psychologically safe spaces in our teams, in our organizations, in our systems. And so when we think about, gosh, this takes a lot of time, this is a lot of energy, this is a lot of effort. Yes, it is. And it's worth it. So leaders must either invest a reasonable amount of time attending to fears and feelings, or squander an unreasonable amount of time trying to manage ineffective and unproductive behavior. And so I think that when Robin was sharing a lot of statistics from the workforce development piece earlier, we see that. We see so much time and effort and emotional cost to our staff because we're not taking the time up front to attend to those fears that staff have, to attend to the feelings and emotions that come up, and particularly shame. That's a huge area that I think people tend to shy away from generally in society, but especially at work, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Next slide, please. So number 1, who we are is how we lead. And I fully believe that the number 1 thing that any leader can do to improve really kind of anything on their team is to do their own work, right? So who we are is how we lead. That is the work that we do or that we don't do, and how we show up has a direct impact on our staff, on everybody that we work with. There's a lot of research out there that talks about the emotions and how leaders show up emotionally in the workspace has a direct effect on the productivity of the staff that work with them. And so if we're not attending to our fears and feelings, if we're not digging in and understanding our stealth expectations, our stealth intentions, our biases that we have, we've got to be able to sit and do that work. We've really got to look at how shame shows up for us, especially in the workplace. We've got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. A good friend of mine, that's a quote that she uses all the time, because it's not comfortable work. If we wait until we're comfortable, we're going to be waiting a really long time. So it's not easy work. It's hard. We're going to mess up. We're going to fail, which is part of why it's so important to make sure that we're contributing to a psychologically safe space. And we've got to model the behaviors that we want to see from our team. We've got to be willing to own our mistakes and name them in front of the team. We've got to be able to encourage people to fail. We have to be willing to fail and name that we're failing and own that. And we've got to be able to ask for help. There's a study done. Amy Edmondson did some work, and Google together found that the number one indicator for trust building behaviors at work is to ask for help. That's the number one thing that we can do. So next slide, please. So we've got to be willing as leaders to show up and be willing to ask for help ourselves and model what that behavior looks like if we expect our team to be able to participate in the same way. Number two, invest time and space to create safe spaces in teams. And so if we don't take the time at the beginning of initiatives to create safe spaces, or when new members come on board, or even right now, just start now and take the time. As it's talked about in the first slide, we're going to waste a lot of time on the back end, right? In unproductive behaviors. And so it's super important. And if you're doing implementation science work, that means that you're doing major change initiatives. If you're working in a system, that means that you are working on major change initiatives. And so it's so important to be able to invest that time up front and give that time and space for teams to be able to engage with each other and intentionally create the spaces that we want to be able to show up in. The team from New York City talked a lot about that and how they were able to very intentionally, even in the face of some fear and some doubts, right? They were able to show up and create those spaces very intentionally. And it's had a long-term impact on not only their team, but the outcomes with all of the people that they work with. Next slide, please. And number three, leaders are anyone who has the courage to develop the potential in people and in processes. And so that's an amended quote from Brene Brown, but anybody who has the capacity to influence somebody else has the capacity to be a leader. And that means all of our staff. That doesn't just mean positional leadership. That doesn't just mean people who manage teams or have people that report to them. And that doesn't just mean our staff. That means youth and families and children that we work with have a capacity to lead, whether it's in their own lives or in their neighborhoods, or in our case planning and with whatever's happening with their family as well. And so it's so important to treat not only your team, but also the people we work with as the leaders that they are. Everyone has a capacity to lead. And we've got to be able to invest our belief, our time, and our resources into developing our team's leadership potential. Not only does that help us internally with our efficiency, that helps to increase their impact on all of the work that we all do every day. And then hold ongoing trainings and coaching with attention to psychological safety processes to ensure continuity and to ensure that we're attending to that container that we've built. So it's very important to, one, dedicate that time and space at the beginning, get everybody on board, create that safe space, but then we've also got to keep attending to that as we move through the work. And so this does not have to be a $50,000 contract and we take everybody offline for 5 days in some fancy place. This can be, book clubs. We can give an hour a week. We can, hold intentional space to just develop the relational side of our work and not just focus on the task side of things. Things like having team lunches. Those are really important things that we can do that don't have a high cost, that we, if we're intentional about, can really contribute to ensuring that we create and keep these psychologically safe spaces together so that we can be creative, that we can innovate, that we can rejuvenate in the work that we all do every day. Next slide. this is one of my favorite things. So when we've done research, and there's research for decades on this, that in corporate business and industry, when companies invest in leadership development across all levels of their organization, they outperform their peers times 13 in key metrics. That is not double or triple, that is times 13. And so if we imagine what would our outcomes be, what would our families and what would our children and youth and what would our communities look like if we had these same results in our industry, if we could times 13 the outcomes that we're producing with our young people and our families. It's an incredible opportunity for us to take a breath, invest in leadership development for ourselves, for our teams, and for the people that we work with. So I will now turn it over to Christine, and hopefully we'll get some time to hear some question and answers from y'all. Thank you.
Yes, the chat has been really active, and I know we're so tight on time. So I'm going to just pose 1 or 2 questions and maybe just ask one panelist to respond, just so we can get to as many as we can in about 2 minutes of time. One that came in very early on during Robin's presentation that anyone, of course, can chime in, was thinking about how can the organization really change values that have become so deeply embedded in our culture, right? Thinking about how work is sometimes often undervalued with gender bias. Oh, that's women's work. How do you change the, how do you change culture when things have been so deeply embedded?
Yeah, I loved that question so much. And I think, it's such a pervasive problem that the most important jobs in our society are undervalued. Teachers and early childhood providers and social workers and elderly care providers. And one of the reasons I think we see such strong bonding in the workforce and strong supervision and peer support is having a group of peers that really gets you and understands this work and is in it with you can be a really powerful protective force. I know in child welfare there's a lot of work in that leaders are engaging in and working with communities, partnering with communities to really understand the work that we do and value it, working with the media, working on public perceptions of child welfare, because it's just, it can be a powerful positive and negative force. I don't know if that really gets at the question, but I think that that job importance piece and some of the discord between that personal feelings of, I know this job is important and we're making a difference, and the public perception, I think, from the outside of what this work is.
Squeeze in one more and just say that people have been really thankful for how practical the guidance has been and want examples of the checklist and assessments. But one last question that came in that maybe someone can answer quickly is just, and maybe this is from Lacey's presentation, was really just about how do you even assess for leadership when you're hiring to make sure that you're seeing that relationship leadership? What are the qualities that they should be looking for in hiring to get those type of leaders in-house?
Yeah, I think one of the first things is actually not about skill sets, it's about values and value alignment and how values are operationalized. And if we make sure that we have alignment in that from the beginning, all the rest of the work is going to be a lot easier. But also things like dealing with ambiguity, emotional literacy, compassion, and boundaries are huge. And so we've got to be able to have boundaries if we're going to keep compassion. And so and keep staying in this work and sustaining ourselves and supporting other people. So those are some of the key things that we don't necessarily look at as technical skills, but are hugely important in sustaining this work.
Thank you so much. I am pushed for time, so I'm going to pause there. Thank you, everybody, for we welcome all your questions in the chat. I'll pass it back to Cynthia.
Hello again. So what a wonderful morning we've had. Dr. Leek shared revealing child welfare organizational data. I did my best to walk us through safe and unsafe workplace cultures and the need for psychological safety. Deborah shared our safety culture implementation work with the New York City ACS. Dr. Mann highlighted there is no us in them, there's just us. And Lacey reminded us of the importance of daring leadership. As we wrap up our time together and you return to your workplaces and everyday routines, I urge you all as leaders in your own right to do things differently, to become advocates for change, to make creating psychological safety a priority. The enhancement in performance, greater engagement, and morale will soon become obvious to us all. So I encourage you all to show yourself and those around you compassion. Strive to create a positive error culture where you replace blame with curiosity, where you see opportunities for learning in every mistake or unsuccessful endeavor. After all, making mistakes is what makes us human. Learning from them is what makes us magnificent. Commit to getting to know a colleague or team member you do not normally interact with. Empower your staff to give you feedback to contribute to your growth. And if and when you are called upon to give feedback, be courageous. Recognize your peers and leaders for their work. Make peer recognition an everyday occurrence in the workplace. Go ahead and be a cheerleader for your colleagues. Give people due credit for their contributions and ideas. Include staff in decision-making. Find creative and thoughtful ways to encourage joy in the workplace and build your teams. Encourage and provide safe spaces for staff to solve problems, not just identify them. Make meetings meaningful. Remind every member of your team how they contribute to supporting the organizational mission. Talk less, listen more. Have someone from your team run a meeting or let someone else give ending remarks to close your meeting. Encourage innovation and risk-taking. Even if an idea fails, acknowledge the effort. They just stuck their neck out to help improve your system. I urge us all to autograph our work with good intentions, to give ourselves and our teammates grace, and inspire each other to plant safety in everything we do. Finally, I dare you all to spark a crusade for psychological safety in your organizations. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Cynthia, and thank you to all the panelists. I feel like Thierry, I at the beginning said that all of these women that we're going to talk today had influenced me. I am 100% sure they've influenced you. I predicted that. I can see in the chat that that's true. I hope you all understand and think about how lifting up the construct of psychological safety and a culture of safety is critical for the field of implementation. That what you heard today was the human side of this work, and not just these phrases like complex systems, but something deeper and more human than that, and what it means for people to feel safe in their work, and that should be incorporated into everything we measure, everything we plan for, and everything that we cultivate as implementation practitioners. So I really encourage you to think about this today. I'm so deeply grateful to the panelists. I do want to note their full bios are available on the event page. If you have trouble contacting any of the panelists individually, just reach out. We know them, so we can connect you. They have so much to offer. I can't say enough about that. So please reach out to us if you have any trouble connecting with whoever you'd like to connect with today. This session has been recorded. We usually get it up on the websites within a couple of days. Look for that quick evaluation. Todd, I think you send that out. I'm confused now about that, but I think we send that out. Stay tuned for upcoming events. We know we have an event in September. I'm not sure if we'll do a spring event. We've been trying to run these every couple months. They take a lot to plan, so bear with us. Hopefully they're worth the wait when they come. And just thank you so much. I think we still have a minute, so please look at the chat and jump in with anything you'd want to say.